Good morning. Welcome to Morning Moments. I have all the way from Springfield, Illinois, a actor, a speaker. He has been typecast. It's hard for him to get out of this role. Fritz Klein, and you have seen him in movies and not known it. This is Abraham Lincoln, if you've ever seen him. Now he's not made up today as Abraham, but thank you, Fritz, for joining us today for Morning Moments.
Yeah, let me just begin by saying it's amazing what God can do with a bald man with gray whiskers.
Absolutely. I know your feeling. Yes, yes. They
Well,
they don't put marble tops on cheap furniture. That's what I tell people.
I got that. I love it. I love it.
Well, tell me, what do you do and why do you do it?
Okay. Well, I portray Abraham Lincoln, and I'll try to make a long story as short as possible. um, when I was a kid, I was raised in a Christian home. And I went to church and all the stuff that Christian kids do in Christian homes. Um, so I knew that Jesus was the answer, but I figured that he was a nice and useful addition to my life until I got into some what I believed was pretty deep trouble in high school, and I turned to him in a more serious way and said, "I'm not going to get out of this mess unless you help me. So if you do, I promise I'll give my life to you," which to me, as a kid in my particular church, meant that I was supposed to be a minister. Though they were the only people who apparently were very serious about this stuff. So so God got me out of my mess, and I decided that I was going to go to the seminary and study, and it seemed like a good course. And I really believed that what I was doing was exactly the thing to do. You know, Jesus says uh, if you put the kingdom first, he'll give you everything. So while I was in the seminary, it's actually pre-seminary days, but it was in my denomination kind of a package 4 years before and 4 years after as a graduate student. But in the midst of it all, and back in 1970, I I was spontaneously filled with the Holy Spirit. Sitting in my dorm room, I began speaking in tongues and didn't even know what was happening to me. And I was miraculously healed of some things that were so noticeable that everybody on campus could tell immediately I had been healed. So that actually became a huge turning point in my life. And I began to, I let loose of my previous goal, and I got a new goal, and that was I'm going to try to follow Jesus as best I can wherever that takes me. Well, at that point, I was I left the seminary and took up a lucrative job driving school buses, and tongue in cheek. But God began leading, and I lived in St. Louis at the time. My parents were in California, and I would go back as a young man in my 20s to visit, as young people do. And I was in a meeting one time with my parents, and a man who was speaking, who didn't know me from Adam, his name was Dick Mills, suddenly interrupted his message and said, "The Lord just told me that there's somebody in the audience that I need to pay attention to. He told me years ago that he was going to show me three people who he was going to use in the media, on television, etc. And one of them is here tonight. Would that young man in the back row please come forward?" And he pointed at me. So I did, and he came forward and prayed over me. And I went back to St. Louis absolutely bewildered. And I told my pastor, and we both had a good chuckle. And he said, "Well, put that one on the shelf." So I did. Well, make a long story short, my wife and I, well, we weren't actually married at the time, but we ended up in Youth with a Mission. And we, in 1975, and we were thinking and praying about what to do, and somebody on our YWAM base got the idea of doing something for the upcoming National Bicentennial. It was to be a portrayal of Abraham Lincoln, and I was probably the only man on the YWAM base that had a beard, and it wasn't gray in those days. And so I got elected, and I thought, okay, I'll do this. And I did for a long weekend, and it was all good. People began afterwards asking me if I would do it again, and and telling me that I really fit the part, which I had never imagined before. But we finished our missionary training, and as we prayed about what where God wanted us to go, we were thinking maybe Asia. Um, he spoke to both my wife and I independently and said, "No, I want you to go back to the mainland," because we were in Hawaii at the time, and start portraying Abraham Lincoln. Uh, I thought, really? um, but we decided we would do this, and as I began to study about Abraham Lincoln, I realized that on 9 different occasions he called the nation to prayer and or fasting or thanksgiving or repentance or something that was appropriate for his day in which he lived. And so I put together some programming for that, and I felt like God said that's what He wanted me to do, and but that and I began to speak in churches primarily, issuing through Lincoln's words a call to pray for the nation and to turn back to God. The Lord showed me at the time that that's what I was to do, but that they weren't going to listen, and I kind of felt like Jeremiah. But I mean, this is all strange stuff, to me. But I continued, and so after several years, I realized that on offerings, I wasn't going to make it, and that people in the churches treated me kind of like a novelty, but it was mostly it wasn't having the effect that I had hoped. And so as I prayed about it, I felt like the Lord said to go in, just to follow whatever He led me into. And so I began to go to schools and speak to children about being honest and living a good life, and prayer, using Lincoln's words and example. And that developed into other things. And lo and behold, I started being asked to do television spots and commercials and then movies, and it just expanded. And it became full-time in 1980. In 1982, we were with YWAM in Texas, and we just looked at the various places in the country where there was some Lincoln tourism, because by that time I had a young family, and it was tough to be gone a lot. So we ended up here in Springfield, Illinois. Back in Hawaii, before they sent us out, we had some times of prayer, and some of the people felt like the Lord was showing them that I would end up doing all kinds of things with carriages and what looked like movie type settings. All of that has come true. And I'm certainly no famous movie star, but with a very narrow sphere of interest in the Lincoln field. God's given me a good name, and as it turned out, I really can look like Lincoln quite well.
Yes.
And I'm happy to have a marble top, because I can take all the fur off, and it sort of dissipates. And people don't realize that if everywhere you go, you're known as somebody different than who you really are, you start feeling like Leonard Nimoy or something, who couldn't get away from people calling him Spock. And so I'm glad to be able to remove my hair and have gray hair now finally, and people don't bring the subject up very often, But what's happened is, over the years, I've started to see that there's a lot of people who may not be very open to religion per se, but they're open to goodness. Everybody's open to goodness, especially if it's directed towards them. And by being a man of character, and I really don't hold a candle to Lincoln, but to try to portray this individual who lived in tumultuous times, I've sown seeds and provided an example for people to emulate. And I know that people have had the experience of actually being in Lincoln's presence, so to speak, and it's pretend, it's like a movie, but when it's over, there's an aspiration that comes forward in people's lives that that I've helped, and hopefully it steers people back towards the things that Lincoln practiced. You know, in recent years, probably for the past 10 years, God has been leading my wife and I into Asia, and we have a home over there. We go in the winter. We just got back a couple of weeks ago, and people in our country don't realize how much of what we possess in this country is based on the Bible. When you live in a country that's based on Buddhism, you realize that um, when your culture does not have a biblical base like this culture, people do horrible things because they don't have a sense of a living God who's watching them. And I mean, I could tell you horrible stories about Buddhism, but about a culture that has grown up in that. But my goal isn't to denigrate another religion. But Jesus is alive, and he does really lead people sometimes in strange ways, but he leads them into what is good for them and for their world. And if we give our lives to him, we don't know what it's going to do. We don't know. I mean, I'm 73 now. It's hard to go to Asia, and our last trip back was a 48-hour trip on an airplane, on several airplanes. But if God directs a person, and you go believing that, you have no idea what can happen. So that's it in a nutshell. And the reason I do it is multiple. The primary reason is I've tried to obey my boss, and be a good subject in his kingdom. Secondarily, people need something to aspire to, especially in a world like we live in now where everything's falling apart. And thirdly, in a world which is being subjected to, how do I say this? But I don't want to be an accuser of anybody, but let me put it this way. When Russia fell to the Bolsheviks, some of their goals were to wipe out all history, especially the influence of Christianity in Russia. So St. Petersburg was renamed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in some of the Soviet satellite countries, they sought to erase the history of Poland or the history of Romania, and especially the history and the influence of the church and what their culture meant, and then force them to learn something new. Now, I'm no prophet, but whatever's going on in our country right now, we need to know where we came from. We need to have a new vision that our culture and our people were founded in faith and in biblical principles of honesty and integrity and a lot of things that you're not going to find in other religions or other parts of the world, not selfishness. And that's the evil that's taking over now. And so to portray somebody like Lincoln, who knew he may end up giving his life for others in a tumultuous day where he daily didn't know what was going to happen in his culture and in his time, and that the whole thing looked like it might be the end. But he pressed on towards a goal, something he believed was a good goal, and he was willing to give his life for. And to be able to portray that to people, even though it's from a different time and a different era with different kinds of problems, inspires people to be like-minded for our era, for our problems, and for the unanswered questions that are before us. So that's kind of my third goal. But as time goes on, it's becoming a more important goal. Some of the things that we took for granted in just a few years ago, we don't take for granted anymore. And people are asking a lot of questions. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing. there's a shaking going on in the world these days, and there was in Lincoln's day. Maybe it wasn't so worldwide in his day, but in another sense it was, because he believed in the biblical and practiced the biblical principle of treating others like you want to be treated yourself. And that's a form of equality that he believed in. He didn't believe in equality of outcome, which is a whole other scenario. And that, Andrew Jackson had kind of touted that and so on, and attacked the rich and so on. But Lincoln stood by that principle and treated people the way he wanted to be treated. And so, as we look to the future, the biblical principles on which our culture was built, we're finding new meaning in those things. And it's good to seek and to question and to get back to our roots. So if I can play a part in doing that, even though it may be a small part for a very small little segment of our population, people that admire Lincoln, it's worth it. And I'm happy to do it. So that's it in a nutshell.
What a great message. What a great message, Fritz, to have you on. Something that hit me when you said that some people walk up to you and they feel like they've been in the presence of Abraham Lincoln, although it's kind of false because you're not Abraham Lincoln, but they felt like they were in Abraham Lincoln's presence.
Yeah.
As great as Abraham Lincoln was, and as great as his message of equality is, there's somebody that you can be in the presence of that I want to just mention. God's got a purpose, a hope, and a plan for you.
Yeah.
And if you would come to not as the religions of the world, as Fritz has said, but you come to him in a relationship, you will be not only seen a historical Jesus, but you'll be in his presence.
Yes.
You can say, I felt the presence of the living God. He loves you, cares for you. He's got a plan for your life. He knows where you've been. He knows where you're going. And he really, really loves you. That's a message I think that we need to hear today. Thank you so much, Fritz, for sharing.
You're most welcome.
Down below, you'll see some of the links that I'm going to put down for Fritz and all the movies he's been in. You will not believe some of the movies he's been in. Some of you have seen those movies and go, I didn't realize it was him. And the movies and his website to talk about what he does. And so you can maybe see him in a live performance or maybe even catch some of his ministry, the things that's going on. Before we leave, I want you to take time and pray for Fritz Klein. As soon as this interview is over, stop and pray that God would continue to bless him, use him in a unique way that he has for all these years, and continue to shine his light upon him. Thank you, Fritz, for joining me for Morning Moments.
Thank you, Andy, for allowing me to be with you.
And please keep coming back for some more Morning Moments.